And, all right. John chapter 4, verse 1. When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. And he must needs go through Samaria. Then cometh he into the city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away into the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldst have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman said unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? And Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman said unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Okay, so we're going to stop there. And the title of the lesson today is The Woman at the Well Meets Her Savior. Okay. Last week we learned a little bit about the Pharisees stirring up trouble. And we can see continuation here of chapter 3 at the beginning of chapter 4. It says, When therefore the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John. Okay, and if we know that he didn't baptize, according to verse 2, he did not baptize, but the disciples did. But if we go on to verse 3, he left there. Okay, so the Pharisees definitely were still there. They were stirring up trouble. But he stayed there until he got word that his following was growing and that the Pharisees got the word back. So the spies that they sent out to talk to John from the Pharisees finally got back to the Pharisees, and they reported what was going on and that Jesus's increase was happening and John's decrease was happening. That's key, that he wanted them to know that. But once that happened, he departed. They stayed there until they got word of his following was growing, and as not to stir up trouble with John and John's disciples, he departed. Okay, we can see that in verse 3. We see in verse 2 that he did not baptize, that his disciples did. So now we go on to verse 3 and 4. It says, He left Judea and departed into Galilee. And verse 4 says, And he must needs go through Samaria. I like how that's worded there. He must needs. He had a mission that they didn't realize that he had. There was a divine appointment coming. And now the thing about where he was going was Galilee. Okay? So if you have the regions, you have Galilee at the top, down at the bottom, center, I guess, of Israel, you would have Judea. In between those was the land of Samaria. Okay? Most Jews would go around Samaria. They didn't want to go through Samaria. And why is that? Well, to find that out, we got to go to the Old Testament. So let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 16. We're going to look over in 1 Kings chapter 16. And then we'll be traveling into 2 Kings after that. So let's go 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 21. We want to see who was king at that time. When all the people of Israel divided into two parts, half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and half followed Omri. But the people that followed Omri prevailed against the people that followed Tibni, the son of Ginath. So Tibni died, and Omri reigned. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, began Omri to reign over Israel 12 years, 6 years he reigned in Tisra. And he bought the hill, Samaria, of the Shemer for 2.5 talents of silver, and built on the hill, and called the name of that city which he built after the name of Shemer, owner of the hill, Samaria. So we can see right here, King Omri was the one who named it what it was, Samaria. Okay, and then he named the city that, and then over time it became a region and an area of people. Now, we can see here in verse 25, Omri wrought evil in the eyes of the Lord and did worse than all that were before him. So he was not a good king. All right, so, and then he turned around and he was the one that named Samaria. So there's already starting to be a little bit of a taint to the area of Samaria. Now, let's go over here to 2 Kings 17. We're going to see some stuff in here. 2 Kings 17, 1 through 6. It says here, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea, the son of Elah, to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel that were before him. So he wasn't as bad, but he was bad. Okay, he didn't do the right thing. Against him came Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became servants and gave him presents. And the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Syria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Hala and Habor by the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. Okay, so summarize that. It says, many of the Jews, they were captured by the Assyrians. Okay, they were led away, and many of them were taken out of Samaria and put into what's known as Iraq today, modern day Iraq. The Syrians left a sizable portion of them in the northern part of Samaria. Okay, and then they transported and located many of non-Jews into the area of Samaria. And then over time, these groups intermingled and intermarried and became a different race. Okay, they were half Jews and half Gentile. After the Jews' captivity, they finally were able to return back to Samaria. The ones that were hauled off to Iraq were sent back to the areas where they originally lived in Samaria. And that's the beginning of the tension that started. The Samaritans withdrew from the worship of Yahweh at Jerusalem. They formed their own religion, believing only the first 5 books of the Bible, and that was it. None of the prophecies was carried on. It was only the first 5 books of what we know as the Pentateuch. The Samaritans withdrew from worship at Jerusalem and started worshiping at Gerizim, Mount Gerizim. They only regarded the Pentateuch as authoritative, which is the first 5 books of our Bible. The Jews considered them heretics, and they wanted nothing to do with them. So we can see by the response that Jesus gave at the woman, or the woman gave to Jesus at the well. Let's look over in John here. We're going to look at something here. We can see something that she says, and you can kind of catch a little bit of a tone with what she said here in verse 9. Let's look at verse 9. It says, Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest a drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. So you can kind of see that attitude a little bit right there with her. But let's look a little bit deeper here. Let's go over to Luke 10, and we're going to see some more of the attitude of the time period toward the Samaritan people. And Luke chapter 10 kind of sums it up, and I love this because we see a parable Jesus telling, and it's really, really good here. So let's start at verse 25 of chapter 10. I'm going to get there. Okay, chapter 10, verse 25, it says, And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Okay, we see right off the bat, there's some things going on with this. Here, this lawyer had a little strategy, a little plan, but God knows those strategies, knows those plans. He can outwit anybody on earth because he's God. And he said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. Okay, so here's where the sketchy lawyer comes in. He says, and he said unto him, he said, Thou hast answered right, this do, and thou shalt live. Okay, but he, willing to justify himself, and said unto Jesus, Who is my neighbor? So he wanted to get technical. He really wanted to nitpick this apart so where he could try to catch Jesus in the bad. He wanted to try to make Jesus look bad. And Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him, and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. And he went to him, and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to the inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves? Okay, so Jesus is giving him a real good example here. The Samaritan was the one he's speaking of here. Now, look at verse 37. And he said unto him, He that showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said unto him, Go and do thou likewise. Notice that lawyer wouldn't even say the word Samaritan. There was that much hatred toward the Samaritans, he wouldn't even say what he was. So we can see that hatred, that tension that's going on in the time period of Jesus. This has been going on for over 700 and some years. Okay, because let's see here, the Jews, or we can see by the response that the woman gave at the well, that this was an ongoing for over 700 years, because the Samaritan Jews were taken captive at around 722 BC. So this hatred had been growing this long, 700 and some years. Okay, we have a lot of racial tension in our own country, and it dates back to roughly 200 years is what we're looking at. But this has been going on for over 700 years. This man that Jesus was speaking to here couldn't even say Samaritan, the word Samaritan, as if he was to say it, it was just going to defile himself. And I just find that very interesting. He referred to him as the one who showed mercy. So anyways, he couldn't even say the word Samaritan because of his the racist heart he had. Jesus knew what kind of heart he had. He was trying to set Jesus up, and Jesus turned around and exposed his racism in that. He knows, he always knows. Now, let's go back to John 4 and verse 5, and let's see what else we can find here. Verse 5 says, Then cometh he into the city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. All right, so Sychar is currently the village of Ascar this day and age. It's directly between the edge of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And if you look in your maps in the back of the Bible, you can see the time period of Jesus. You can see the two mountains, and then right between them is where this is at. Okay, so verse 6. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being weary with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. Okay, the well they're talking about is a continuous, there's Jacob's well, and it's a continued line of tradition that identifies Jacob's well, and it is about a half a mile south of Sychar, or Ascar today. And we go back to Genesis 33 to kind of get the feel for this and understand about this well. So Genesis 33 and verse 19. 33:19 says, let's go up to 18. And Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, which he came from Pandanaram, and pitched his tent before the city. And he bought a parcel of field where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And he erected there an altar and called it Elio-he-Israel. Okay. He stayed there a while. He bought that land. He stayed there a while. In order to live on that land, what was he going to have to do? He was going to have a water source. You're talking cattle, sheep, all the animals that he had to be raised. They had to be watered. Had to be a place to get them water. Therefore, he bought the land, lived there long enough, and he needed a well to survive, and thus it is still there to this day. That's what I find very fascinating. That well is still used to this day. They've actually constructed a Greek Orthodox church there, and it's been destroyed and rebuilt several times. But you can actually see that and today and go over there and visit that place today. Now, the term used here for the word well is that of a running spring. And later on, there's a different term used, and we'll get to that in a minute. But if we look here, we can see who started the well. And if we look now, let's go over to Hebrews. Let's go over to Hebrews 2. Hebrews 2. And we're going to see something else in this verse. Okay, so it says here in I want to read this to you. It says here in John 6, it says, "Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour." So Jesus was wearied from his trip. The human form that Jesus took had limitations. He could not physically do all the stuff that he wanted to do. Jesus even said himself, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is what? Weak. Okay, well, let's look here in verse 9 of chapter 2 in Hebrews, and we're going to read some of this. We'll see some of the humanity of Christ. "But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. For it became him for whom all things, and by whom all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he that sanctifieth and they who are sanctified are all of one. For which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the church I will sing praise unto thee. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children which God hath given to me. For as much then as the children are partakers of the flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil. So we can see he became flesh to feel every earthly thing that we feel. And he, in this verse here, back in John, was physically tired. They had just been hiking for a long time, and he decided that he's going to sit here by the well and rest and let the disciples go ahead and go into town and gather some food. Now, the last thing in this verse here, it says the time was about noontime, 12 o'clock noon, which is the 6th hour. Okay, Jewish time started at 6 a.m. and it ran around each hour till you get to noon. That's 6 hours, and so it's around noontime. Why is this important? Verse 7. That's why. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. The woman came after noon. Why would she come here at noon? She was an outcast. She was an outcast. Many reasons, but the biggest one is that most of the women would travel in groups to collect water early in the morning. 1, for safety reasons. 2, to be able to help each other. You know, some of the women were not physically strong. They needed help, so they would travel in groups. And 3, they would do this early in the morning and later in the evening, and like the pre-evening time, before it got dark, to avoid the heat of the day. So here it is, noon, it's warm, and here's this woman coming out and getting water. Jesus knew that this woman would be there at noon. Now, so she was a social outcast. She was obviously there at a hot time alone because of her reputation and her public shame caused her to be isolated from the other women. Now, let's look on in that verse. Jesus said unto her, he said, give me to drink. For a Jewish man to speak to a woman publicly was just like a social no-no. Okay, that didn't happen. Now, for a rabbi or religious leader, they wouldn't even consider talking to a woman of ill repute. Okay, so we got to understand those things about this woman. Now, we go on to verse 8. It says, for his disciples were gone away into the city to buy meat. Okay, all of the disciples left except for one. Anyone know who that one is? The author of this book, John. How else could he get such an accurate account of what happened? Witnessed Jesus talking to this woman. Witnessed all the things that is going to unfold in this story that we'll probably get into next week. But I want you to see some of these points because we have an eyewitness accurate account. Now, they bought food handled by those filthy Samaritans. Imagine that. Think about that. Those filthy Samaritans were handling their food. I remember working at the prison one time, and they had, on the menu that day, they had bacon. And this inmate come up to me and he said, I can't have that bacon. And I was like, well, I understand that if you got a non-pork card. Non-pork card is a card that mostly the Muslims had, but this particular fellow was Jewish. He said putting the pork on his plate defiled his whole plate. And I told him, I said, dude, you got to understand where you're at. Now, I understand you want your religious beliefs. I get that. But you should have thought about those sort of things before you got in here. You was not too religious until you got caught. But now, all of a sudden, we have that. But the thing about it is, he said if it just touches the plate, it can't eat any of the food on the thing. Here they are. They're getting food from Samaritans, half-breeds, non-full Jews, non-Orthodox Jews. Okay? So some of the Jews had a self-imposed regulation not to eat food handled by the Samaritans. Obviously, Jesus' disciples didn't. Now, was that because of his teaching? Probably was. Because Jesus talked about it's not what goes into a man that defiles him. What defiles him is what comes out of him. All right? So let's look on verse 10. And it says, Jesus answered and said unto her, if thou knewest the gift of God, and who it was that saith to thee, give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. All right. So, what did God give us? What was that gift? The greatest gift ever. His only unique Son. Living water. We do not have enough time to go through these, so we're going to probably have to come back and get through some of these verses here, because there is a lot that we got to go through here on these. But we'll just close it here at verse 10, and we'll start. We'll go back and recap on 9 next week, and then try to get some more of this done. But there is so much more into this. It is just a fascinating study. So we'll close with that and be dismissed. Thanks.